Thomas knelt on the dusty attic floor, his trembling hands touching the wooden trunk that had been locked for 30 years. Downstairs, the heavy slam of the door signaled that Leo had run off again with his gang, leaving his 72-year-old father in total despair. Among old photos and Vietnam War papers, Thomas found his mother's diary. Every word she wrote was a dagger to his heart. She had cried her eyes out over his own rebellion decades ago, just as he was losing Leo now. Thomas realized his silence wasn't enough to save his son from his own dark footsteps. That night, he made a daring decision. He disappeared, leaving only a note saying, "I love you," and a journey back to the battlefields of his youth to find the man who once saved his life. Will a lost son wake up in time to realize the truth about his cowardly father before the darkness swallows them both? Please support us by subscribing to our channel for more heart-touching stories. The humid evening air hung heavy over the small suburban town. In a narrow garage, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, Thomas sat on a low wooden stool. His hands, mapped with deep lines and calluses from decades of labor, worked methodically to restore a vintage radio. At 72 years old, Thomas moved with a slow, deliberate grace that concealed the lingering pains of his youth. Every turn of a screw was a testament to his patience, a quality he had cultivated long after the thunder of the war had faded from his daily life. The silence of the garage was shattered by the harsh roar of a motorcycle engine pulling into the driveway. Thomas did not flinch. He did not even look up when the heavy door between the garage and the kitchen slammed open. A moment later, Leo walked in. At 18, Leo was a storm of raw energy and unfocused anger. He was the only child of Thomas born late in his life, a miracle that Thomas had once believed would bring him ultimate peace. Instead, as Leo grew, he became a source of constant aching worry. Tonight, the boy was wearing a sleeveless denim jacket that proudly displayed a fresh, dark tattoo winding around his bicep. It was a jagged, aggressive design, the mark of a local group that Thomas knew all too well. Thomas set his screwdriver down and finally looked at his son. He saw the fire in the boy's eyes, the defensive hunch of his shoulders, and the way he sneered at the modest surroundings of their home. Leo grabbed a soda from the small refrigerator in the corner and leaned against the workbench, staring at the old radio. He laughed, a dry and mocking sound. He asked why his father spent so much time fixing junk that was older than the hills. He said that a man with real ambition would have moved out of this neighborhood a long time ago. Thomas remained quiet. His silence was not born of weakness, but of a profound and terrifying recognition. As he looked at Leo, he did not see a stranger. He saw a mirror. He remembered himself decades ago returning home to an America that felt alien and cold. He remembered the leather jackets, the reckless nights, and the way he used to look at his own father with that same mixture of pity and contempt. Leo continued his verbal assault, his voice rising in pitch. He paced the small space of the garage, gesturing wildly. He complained about the lack of money in their house and the old truck that barely started in the morning. He called his father a coward for being content with a life of quiet service and small repairs. He told Thomas that he wanted a life of respect and power, and that his new friends were going to help him get it. Thomas felt a sharp pang in his chest. He wanted to reach out and grab his son by the shoulders. He wanted to tell him that respect earned through fear is a hollow victory. He wanted to explain that he had seen enough blood and chaos in his youth to last 10 lifetimes, and that peace was the most expensive thing a man could ever own. But he knew the words would fall on deaf ears. When his own mother had tried to warn him about the dangerous men he was running with, Thomas had laughed just as Leo was laughing now. The boy stepped closer to the workbench, his shadow looming large against the pegboard of tools. He told Thomas that his new friends were his real family. They did not hide in garages fixing broken wires. They took what they wanted from the world. He looked at his father's worn boots and sighed, shaking his head. Thomas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. He told Leo that a man who takes what he wants often ends up losing what he needs. He asked his son if he truly believed those boys would stand by him when the world turned dark. Leo snapped back instantly. He told Thomas that he was just a tired old man who was afraid of the world. He said that Thomas had spent his whole life hiding and that he refused to do the same. With a final disdainful glance at the radio, Leo turned and walked out the screen door, rattling in his wake. Thomas sat back on his stool and let out a long, heavy breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of himself as a young man standing with a group of men he no longer called friends, wearing an expression of arrogant defiance that mirrored Leo's perfectly. The weight of the past felt heavier than ever. Thomas looked at the radio, then at the empty doorway. He knew that the gang Leo was joining was not just a group of rebellious kids. They were a doorway to a life of violence and regret, a cycle that Thomas had spent half a century trying to break. He realized that his quiet example had not been enough to shield his son from the allure of the shadows. As the crickets began their nightly chorus outside, Thomas leaned his head against his workbench. He felt a deep sense of failure, yet beneath it a desperate burning need to intervene. He could not let Leo follow that path. He had seen where it ended in shallow graves and broken hearts. He thought of his mother, and how she must have prayed for him during those dark years after the war. The mirror of rebellion was shining brightly in the night, and Thomas knew he was running out of time to shatter it before it claimed his son forever. The morning sun filtered through the dust motes in the garage, but it brought no warmth to Thomas as he sat at his workbench. The encounter from the previous night had left a bitter taste in his mouth, a flavor of old regret that even the strongest coffee could not wash away. He was reaching for a wrench when the shadow of a long, sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Thomas froze. He recognized the hum of that engine, a sound that belonged to a world he had tried to bury deep beneath the soil of his quiet suburban life. A man stepped out of the car. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Thomas's entire workshop, but the expensive fabric could not hide the predatory stillness of his gait. It was Miller, a man Thomas had once known in the chaotic years following his return from overseas. Back then, they had been brothers in a different kind of war. One fought in back alleys and dimly lit warehouses. Miller walked into the garage without an invitation, his polished shoes crunching on the stray metal shavings. He looked around, with a thin, knowing smile, his eyes finally settling on Thomas. He remarked that the place was a far cry from the old days. He said he had heard that Thomas was living like a ghost, but he had also heard about the trouble brewing with young Leo. Thomas stood up slowly, his joints aching. He told Miller that his son's business was his own. He kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Miller leaned against a tool cabinet and let out a soft whistle. He told Thomas that the streets were talking. He said that the boys Leo was running with were small-time sharks who would eat a kid like him for breakfast. Then came the offer, delivered with a casualness that made Thomas's skin crawl. Miller said he could make a few phone calls. He could have a group of men pay a visit to Leo's new friends. They would break a few spirits and send a message so loud that those boys would never dare look in Leo's direction again. He promised that Leo would be back home terrified, but safe within 24 hours. For a split second, a dark flame ignited in Thomas's chest. The old Thomas, the one who had walked through the fire without blinking, screamed for him to say yes. It would be so easy. A single nod and the problem would be erased. He could protect his son with the same brutal efficiency he had once used to protect himself. He imagined the look of relief he might feel knowing those thugs were no longer a threat. But then Thomas looked at his own hands. He remembered the weight of the shadow that had followed him for decades because of choices like the one Miller was offering. He realized that if he used the underworld to save Leo, he would be validating everything the boy believed. He would be showing Leo that violence was the ultimate currency, and that power was the only thing that mattered. If he used the monster to fight the monsters, he would be handing Leo's soul over to the darkness on a silver platter. Thomas took a deep breath and looked Miller straight in the eye. He told him that the answer was no. He said he was not going back to that life, and he would not use those methods to raise his son. Miller's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He asked Thomas if he was really going to let his pride get in the way of his son's safety. He called Thomas soft and said that the years of playing the humble mechanic had turned his blood to water. He warned that if something happened to Leo, the guilt would be a heavy burden for an old man to carry. Thomas felt the insult like a physical blow. The urge to reach out and show Miller that his blood was still very much iron was almost overwhelming. The monster inside him, the one he had spent 50 years caging, was clawing at the bars. It whispered that he could crush this man's arrogance in a heartbeat. But Thomas gripped the edge of his workbench until his knuckles turned white. He knew that the moment he struck the cage would vanish forever. He told Miller to leave. He said it with a finality that brooked no argument. Miller shrugged, adjusted his tie, and walked back to the sedan. He called back over his shoulder that Thomas was making a mistake, and that some debts are paid in ways a man can never foresee. As the car pulled away, Thomas sank back onto his stool. He was shaking, not from fear of Miller, but from the intensity of the struggle within himself. The garage felt smaller now, crowded by the ghosts of his past. Later that afternoon, Leo came home. He was louder and more arrogant than the night before, boasting about a deal his new friends were planning. He walked past Thomas, barely acknowledging him, but pausing long enough to sneer at the old man's tired eyes. He asked if Thomas had spent the whole day hiding in the garage again, afraid to face the real world. Thomas looked at his son, seeing the bruises of an ego that was trying too hard to be tough. He felt the sting of the boy's contempt, but he chose to swallow it. Every insult from Leo was a sharp needle, but it was a price Thomas was willing to pay. He would endure the mockery, the disrespect, and the loneliness. He would let Leo believe he was a coward if it meant the boy still had a chance to find a different way. He watched Leo go upstairs, the house shaking with the force of the bedroom door slamming shut. Thomas turned back to his radio, but the wires seemed blurred. He knew Miller was right about one thing: the danger was real. But Thomas also knew that a man could only be saved if he learned to save himself. He had chosen the harder path, the one lined with silence and endurance. He was wrestling with a demon that Leo could not see, fighting a war that had no medals, only the hope of a future that did not end in blood. In the quiet of the evening, Thomas prayed for the strength to remain a shadow, to be the steady ground that Leo might one day choose to stand upon. He would wait. He would endure. And he would never let the monster wake up, no matter how much it cost his heart. The afternoon sky over Oak Ridge turned a bruised shade of purple before finally surrendering to a relentless cold rain. Thomas stood in the middle of the local cemetery, his old coat soaked through and clinging to his weary shoulders. He remained motionless before two modest headstones that marked the final resting places of his parents. The rain washed over the granite, making the carved names glisten under the dim light. He felt a profound, aching silence in his chest. He had come here seeking answers, or perhaps just a moment of connection with the only people who had ever truly known the man he was before the world broke him. He whispered a quiet apology into the wind, though he was not entirely sure what he was apologizing for: his own past failures or his current inability to save his son. When Thomas finally returned home, the house was dark and empty. Leo was out again, likely chasing the dangerous shadows that Thomas had spent his life trying to outrun. Shivering from the cold, Thomas bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for the small pull-down ladder that led to the attic. His joints complained with every step as he climbed into the cramped, dusty space beneath the roof. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. He moved aside a few cardboard boxes until he reached a heavy wooden trunk tucked away in the furthest corner. It was bound in tarnished brass and smelled of cedar and thyme. With a trembling hand, Thomas lifted the lid. Inside lay the fragments of a life he had pushed into the recesses of his mind. There were old military ribbons, a folded flag, and beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, a small leather-bound book. It was his mother's diary. Thomas sat on a nearby crate, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the shingles just inches above his head. He opened the book to the middle where the ink seemed fresher, though the pages were brittle. As he began to read, the world around him seemed to vanish. The entries were from the years immediately following his return from overseas. His mother's handwriting was elegant but shaky, revealing a heart that was slowly breaking in real time. She wrote about the nights she sat in the kitchen listening to Thomas scream in his sleep as the ghosts of the jungle haunted his dreams. She described the terror she felt when he began coming home at dawn, smelling of cheap whiskey, and wearing the hard, cold expression of a man who had sold his conscience for a seat at a criminal's table. One entry, written in late winter, hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. His mother had described a night when Thomas had returned home in a rage, shouting about how she didn't understand the world and how he didn't need her prayers or her pity. She wrote that she had stood in the hallway watching him stomp his boots and curse the ceiling, and all she could do was hold her breath and pray that the spark of the boy she once knew hadn't been extinguished forever. She wrote that she felt utterly helpless, watching her son drown in a sea of his own, making unable to reach out because he kept pushing her away with every word and every deed. Thomas read on, his eyes blurring. His mother had chronicled her own silent vigil. She had noted how she made his favorite meals even when he didn't show up to eat them. She had written about the way she kept his room clean, hoping that a sense of order might somehow bring order back to his soul. She never confronted him with anger. She never met his violence with more violence. Instead, she had chosen to be the steady flame in a dark house, waiting for him to find his way back to the light. A single hot tear fell onto the page, smudging the ink of a word she had written many times, patience. In that dusty attic, Thomas finally understood. He had always looked back at his mother's quiet nature as a sign of her fragility. He had thought she was too weak to stand up to him, too timid to demand he change. But now, as he struggled with Leo, he realized the truth. Her silence had been a shield. Her patience had been a form of war, a war fought against despair and hopelessness. She had loved him with a strength that was far greater than any weapon he had ever carried. She had endured his contempt and his debauchery because she knew that if she let go, there would be nothing left to catch him. Thomas leaned his head back against the rafters and wept. He cried for the woman who had suffered in silence while he played at being a tough man. He cried for the years he had wasted being blind to her sacrifice. Most of all, he cried because he saw the terrifying symmetry of his life. He was now the one sitting in the dark kitchen. He was the one making the meals that went cold. He was the one watching his son walk toward a cliff, unable to grab him without sending them both tumbling over the edge. He realized that he was not just his mother's son. He was her successor. The burden of patient love had been passed down to him. He saw now that his struggle with Leo was not a failure of his authority, but an invitation to show the same grace that had once saved him. His mother had lived through the exact same nightmare, and she had survived it by never giving up on the goodness she knew resided deep within her son. The rain began to taper off, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Thomas carefully closed the diary and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He felt a new kind of resolve, one that was quiet and heavy. He wouldn't fight Leo with the methods of the street, and he wouldn't let the boy's insults break his spirit. He would be the anchor. He would be the lighthouse. He climbed down from the attic and walked into Leo's empty bedroom. He straightened the blanket on the bed and smoothed out a wrinkle in the pillow. It was a small, silent act, but it was all he had. As he turned off the light, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. He was no longer just a father in the shadows. He was a guardian of a legacy of love, a legacy that had been written in tears and kept alive by the quietest hearts. He would wait for Leo just as his mother had once waited for him for as long as it took. The kitchen clock ticked with a heavy rhythmic persistence that seemed to fill every corner of the silent house. Thomas sat at the head of the rectangular wooden table, his back straight, despite the late hour. On the table sat a feast that had taken him the better part of the afternoon to prepare. There was a large pot of slow-cooked beef stew, the kind Leo used to ask for every Sunday when he was a boy. There was a fresh loaf of crusty bread, a bowl of garden salad, and a chocolate cake with 18 candles waiting to be lit. Thomas had even polished the silver spoons that had belonged to his mother. Everything was ready by 7 o'clock in the evening. By 9 o'clock, the steam had stopped rising from the stew. By midnight, the bread had begun to harden, and the chocolate frosting on the cake seemed to lose its luster under the dim yellow light of the kitchen chandelier. Thomas did not move. He did not turn on the television or pick up a book. He simply sat in the quiet, watching the hands of the clock crawl toward the early hours of the morning. He thought about the day Leo was born. He remembered the overwhelming sense of responsibility he had felt, the promise he had made to himself that he would be a better man for this child than he had been for anyone else. He had worked extra shifts at the garage for years to ensure Leo had everything he needed. He had traded his own dreams for the quiet stability of a suburban life, all for the hope that his son would never have to see the things he had seen. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence was broken by the sound of stumbling footsteps on the front porch. The key fumbled in the lock for a long time before the door finally swung open. Leo staggered into the kitchen, his clothes torn and stained with dirt. He smelled strongly of cheap beer and sweat. One of his eyes was beginning to swell shut, and a deep, jagged cut across his knuckles was still slowly oozing blood. Thomas stood up, his heart sinking at the sight of his son's battered face. He moved toward Leo, reaching out a hand to steady him. He spoke in a soft, worried voice, asking what had happened and trying to look at the wound on the boy's hand. Leo violently shoved his father's hand away. He nearly fell over as he gripped the edge of the kitchen table for support. He looked down at the cold food, the birthday cake, and the carefully set places. Instead of gratitude or remorse, his face twisted into a mask of pure venom. He laughed a wet, choking sound and asked Thomas why he bothered. He called the dinner a pathetic display from a pathetic man. Leo's voice was thick with intoxication as he began to recount the night. He had been in a fight outside a warehouse on the edge of town. When the rival group became too many and the police sirens were heard in the distance, the friends he had boasted about, the boys he called his real family, had jumped into their cars and sped away. They had left Leo on the pavement to fend for himself. He had crawled away into the shadows, bleeding and alone, while his brothers abandoned him to the night. Despite the betrayal he had just suffered, Leo's anger remained directed at his father. He told Thomas that he hated this house, and he hated the smell of grease on his father's skin. He said he would rather be beaten on the street every night than spend another minute under the roof of a man who was afraid to live. He looked Thomas in the eye and said that the only thing worse than his friends leaving him was having to come home to a coward. Thomas stood perfectly still. The insults were sharp, intended to draw blood, but they did not move him to anger. Instead, he felt a profound, hollow sorrow that reached down into his soul. He looked at the bruised, broken young man in front of him and saw a stranger. He realized that as long as he stayed here, providing a safety net and a warm meal, Leo would never have to face the consequences of his choices. As long as Thomas was the punching bag for Leo's frustrations, the boy would never look inward to see his own reflection. The breaking point did not come with a shout or a slammed fist. It came with a quiet, devastating clarity. Thomas looked at the cake and the 18 unlit candles. Leo had reached the age of a man, but he was still acting like a wounded animal. Thomas spoke, his voice remarkably calm but heavy with grief. He told Leo that he was right about one thing: it was time for a change. He did not argue or defend his honor. He simply looked at the cold stew and then back at his son. He said that he had spent his life trying to protect Leo from the world, but in doing so, he had prevented Leo from learning how to survive it. Leo sneered, telling Thomas to go ahead and preach his boring lessons. He stumbled past the table and headed toward the stairs, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the linoleum. He shouted over his shoulder that he was going to sleep and that he didn't want to see his father's face in the morning. Thomas did not follow him. He sat back down at the table and looked at the 18 candles. He picked up a match, lit one of them, and watched it flicker for a moment before blowing it out. A single trail of smoke rose toward the ceiling. He knew what he had to do. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, harder than any command he had followed in the jungle. He had to leave. He had to remove the one constant in Leo's life so that the boy would have nothing to lean on but his own character. He had to go back to where his own story had truly begun, to the place where he had first learned about loss and survival. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a cold, pale light into the kitchen, Thomas began to pack a small bag. He moved silently, placing the mother's diary on the center of the kitchen table. Next to it, he laid a small piece of paper. He didn't write a long explanation or a list of grievances. He simply wrote 3 words that had sustained him through his own darkest years. He looked at the house one last time at the cold birthday feast and the shadows of the life he had built. He walked out the front door and did not look back. The father in the shadows was stepping out of the frame, leaving his son to find his own way through the darkness. The international terminal was a sea of moving bodies and echoing announcements, but Thomas moved through it with a singular, quiet focus. He carried only a small duffel bag and a heart heavy with both regret and purpose. As he sat near the boarding gate waiting for the flight that would take him back to Vietnam, he looked out at the gray tarmac. He was not fleeing his responsibilities, nor was he abandoning his son in a fit of despair. He was embarking on a pilgrimage he should have made decades ago. In his pocket, Thomas fingered a worn piece of paper containing a name and an old village address. His mind drifted back to 1972. He remembered the heat, the smoke, and the sudden searing pain of shrapnel tearing into his leg. He remembered lying in the mud waiting for the end when a hand had reached out. It was not an American hand. It was a Vietnamese soldier, a man who should have been his enemy, who had dragged him to safety, bandaged his wound, and vanished into the jungle before Thomas could even speak. That act of mercy had haunted him for 50 years. It was the seed of goodness that had eventually allowed him to bury his own violence. He was going back to find that man or his family, to say the words that had been stuck in his throat for half a century. Thank you. He needed to touch the root of his own redemption to find the strength to save his son. Back in the silent house in Oak Ridge, the morning sun was unforgiving. Leo woke up on the couch, his head throbbing and his hand aching from the fight. The house felt unnaturally still. He called out for his father, expecting a lecture or a cold stare, but his voice just bounced off the walls. He walked into the kitchen. The table was exactly as he had left it, except the food had been cleared away. In the center of the table, sitting in a pool of morning light, was the old leather-bound diary and a small white piece of notepaper. Leo picked up the note. It contained no instructions, no angry reprimands, and no money. It simply read, "I love you." Leo frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He picked up the diary. It smelled of the attic and old paper. He opened it, intending to skim it, but the first sentence caught him off guard. It was dated 1974. It was written by his grandmother, but it was about his father. As Leo read, the hours slipped away. He sat in the kitchen chair, mesmerized and horrified. He read about a man named Thomas who came back from the war with eyes like broken glass. He read about the nights Thomas spent screaming at invisible enemies. He read about the violence, the arrests, and the brush with prison. This was not the boring, cowardly mechanic Leo thought he knew. This was a man who had fought a dragon every single day. Then the tone of the diary changed. It spoke of a baby born late in life. It spoke of a man who terrified himself with his own capacity for anger and who made a solemn vow to lock the monster away so his son would never see it. Leo read a passage where his father had written in the margin, "I will be a shadow so he can be the light. I will be boring so he can be safe. I will take his insults because they are better than his fear." Tears welled up in Leo's eyes, stinging his bruised face. He realized that his father's silence was not weakness. It was a cage made of iron will built to protect Leo from the legacy of trauma. The epiphany was shattered by a heavy, aggressive pounding on the front door. Leo froze. He knew that knock. It was not the rhythmic tap of a neighbor. It was the demand of the wolves. He crept to the window and peered through the blinds. Parked at the curb was the same car that had sped away and left him bleeding the night before. 3 men were standing on the porch. They were the so-called brothers Leo had tried so hard to impress. They pounded again. One of them shouted Leo's name, his voice dripping with false camaraderie laced with threat. They said they needed to store some packages in Leo's garage for a few days. They said he owed them for the trouble caused by the fight. They laughed, joking that the old man wouldn't mind. Fear, cold and sharp, washed over Leo. A day ago, he would have opened the door. He would have let them in, desperate for their approval, desperate to belong. He would have let them turn his father's sanctuary into a warehouse for their crimes. But Leo looked down at the diary in his hands. He looked at the trembling handwriting of his grandmother and the margin notes of his father. He thought of Thomas alone on a plane flying across the world to thank a man who saved him. He thought of the note, "I love you." A new feeling rose in Leo's chest. It was not the hot, reckless anger he was used to. It was something colder, harder, and much stronger. It was integrity. The pounding got louder. The men threatened to kick the door in. Leo walked to the door. He did not open it. He locked the deadbolt with a loud, deliberate click that echoed through the wood. He stood close to the door, pressing his hand against the frame. He spoke clearly, his voice steady despite the shaking of his knees. He told them to leave. He said they were not welcome here. The men outside laughed. They called him names. They told him he was weak just like his father. Leo closed his eyes and whispered to himself that they were wrong. He was strong exactly like his father. He shouted back, telling them that if they did not leave in 1 minute, he was calling the police. He told them he was done. There was a silence on the porch. The threat of the police coming from the boy who had once been so eager to break the law confused them. They kicked the door one last time, a frustrated thud that shook the pictures on the wall, but they did not break it down. Leo heard them cursing their footsteps, retreating down the path. He heard the car doors slam and the engine roar away. Leo slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, clutching the diary to his chest. He was trembling violently, but the house was safe. The garage was safe. He had stood his ground. He had chosen to be alone rather than to be corrupted. He looked at the empty kitchen and whispered into the silence, addressing the father who was thousands of miles away. He promised that when Thomas came home, he would find a son worthy of the sacrifice. The boy, who had wanted to be a gangster, was gone. In his place sat a young man who was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be a father's son. The phone rang 4 times before picking up. The sound of the connection tone echoed in the silent, empty hallway of the house in Oak Ridge. Leo sat on the floor, his back pressed against the front door he had just defended, clutching the receiver with a trembling hand. It was midnight in America, but Leo knew it was already the bright light of day where his father was. A voice clicked on the line. It was hesitant, slightly distorted by the distance. Leo heard his father say hello. For a moment, Leo could not speak. The lump in his throat was a physical weight, blocking the words he had rehearsed a dozen times in the last hour. He took a ragged breath, fighting the tears that were burning his eyes. Finally, he managed to whisper the word, "Dad." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sudden sharp intake of breath. Thomas asked if Leo was safe. The concern in his father's voice broke the dam. Leo began to sob. It was not the crying of a child who scraped his knee, but the deep heaving sorrow of a young man who realized how close he had come to throwing his life away. Between the sobs, the words spilled out. Leo confessed everything. He told Thomas about the street fight and the betrayal by his friends. He told him about the men who came to the door and how scared he had been. Most importantly, he told Thomas that he had read the diary. Leo choked out the apology that mattered most. He said he was sorry for calling Thomas a coward. He said he understood now. He understood that it took more courage to be a quiet father than to be a violent soldier. On the other side of the world, standing in the lobby of a small hotel in Ho Chi Minh City, Thomas closed his eyes. He felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He spoke gently to his son. He told Leo that there was nothing to forgive. He said that growing up means realizing that your parents are just people doing their best to keep the darkness at bay. Thomas then asked a question that changed everything. He asked Leo if he wanted to come and see the truth for himself. He said he did not want to come back just yet because he had a mission to finish, and he wanted Leo to be part of it. 2 days later, Leo stepped off a plane into the humid tropical air of Vietnam. The heat was immediate and enveloping, carrying scents of jasmine exhaust and wet earth. It was a sensory overload compared to the sterile suburbs of America. He scanned the crowd of people waiting outside the arrivals terminal, his heart pounding. Then he saw him. Thomas was standing near a pillar wearing a simple linen shirt and a smile that Leo had not seen in years. Thomas looked different here. The heavy burden of the gray mechanic seemed to have lifted, replaced by a somber but alert presence. They did not say much at first. Leo dropped his bag and hugged his father, holding on tight. It was an embrace that bridged the gap of 18 years of misunderstanding. Thomas patted his son's back, his hand rough and warm. Their journey began the next morning. They did not stay in the bustling city. Instead, they hired a car and headed north toward the Central Highlands, where the mountains pierced the clouds and the rice paddies stretched out like endless green mirrors. As they drove through the lush landscapes, the silence between them was no longer tense. It was companionable. Thomas began to talk. He pointed out landmarks not as tourist attractions, but as chapters in his own history. He pointed to a distant ridge and told Leo that in 1972, that hill had been on fire. Now it was covered in peaceful, swaying grass. Thomas explained that war does not just destroy buildings, it destroys souls. He told Leo about the anger he had brought home, the monster that Miller had tried to wake up. He explained that true strength is not about how hard you can hit or how much fear you can inspire. True strength, he said, is having the power to destroy, but choosing to build instead. It is the ability to look at a person who hates you and choose not to hate them back. Leo listened mesmerized. He looked at the vibrant country outside the window, seeing people working in the fields, children riding bicycles to school, and life flourishing in a place that had once been a battlefield. He realized that if this country could heal from such devastation, then perhaps he and his father could heal too. Their destination was a small village nestled in a valley. Thomas had only an old name and a vague memory of a location. They stopped at local markets, showing the yellowed photograph of the Vietnamese soldier to elders who sat drinking tea. During one of their stops, sitting at a roadside stall, Leo asked his father why he had never told him about the soldier who saved him. Thomas looked into his teacup. He said that some memories are too heavy to carry alone, but he had been afraid that sharing them would burden Leo with the past. He admitted that was his mistake. He told Leo that gratitude is the only thing that can balance out the weight of trauma. He was looking for this man, not just to say thank you, but to prove to himself that the act of kindness in 1972 was not a fluke. He needed to confirm that humanity existed even in the worst of times. Leo reached across the table and took his father's hand. He told Thomas that they would find him. He said they would search every village in the province if they had to. For the next few days, they worked as a team. Leo used his phone to translate maps and communicate with younger locals, while Thomas used his memory and instinct. They slept in small guest houses and ate simple meals. The barrier of age and resentment that had separated them in America dissolved completely. Leo saw his father not as a boring old man, but as a survivor who was actively seeking to close a circle of honor. One evening, as the sun set over a river, painting the water in shades of gold and violet, Thomas stopped the car. He turned to Leo and handed him the old military lighter he had carried for decades. He told Leo that he didn't need it anymore. He said that he had spent so long guarding the shadows that he forgot to enjoy the light. He told Leo that he was proud of him for standing up to the gang, but he was more proud of him for coming here. Leo held the lighter, feeling its cold metal warm up in his palm. He realized that this journey was not just about finding a lost soldier. It was about finding the father he had never known and the man he himself wanted to become. They were getting closer. A shopkeeper in the last village had recognized the unit patch in the photo. He pointed them toward a cluster of houses near the riverbend, saying that a family of veterans lived there. As they drove down the narrow dirt road toward the final destination, Leo looked at Thomas. The old man's face was set in a mixture of hope and anxiety. Leo put a hand on his father's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. He told Thomas that whatever they found at the end of this road, they were finding it together. Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The reconciliation was complete. They had crossed an ocean of water and an ocean of pain to get here, and for the first time in their lives they were traveling in the same direction. The crisp autumn air settled over the town, bringing with it a sense of renewal. In the heart of the community, a modest brick building bustled with quiet activity. This was the local youth mentorship center, a place dedicated to providing psychological support and guidance for teenagers, navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence. Thomas stood near the entrance greeting parents and volunteers with a warmth that had once been foreign to him. He was no longer the solitary figure hiding in the shadows of his garage. He was part of something living and breathing. Across the room, Leo sat in a circle of chairs with a small group of teenagers. Among them was Marcus, a boy with storm clouds in his eyes that reminded Thomas vividly of his own son just a year ago. Leo leaned forward, his voice steady and compassionate. He was not teaching them how to fix machines. He was teaching them how to repair their own spirits. He listened as Marcus spoke about his anger, and instead of judging, Leo nodded. He shared his own story of feeling lost and the mistakes he had made when he thought violence was the only way to earn respect. Thomas watched with swelling pride. Leo had transformed his past pain into a roadmap for others. Since returning from their journey overseas, the bond between father and son had become the foundation of their lives. That trip to the lush rice paddies where Thomas had finally thanked the soldier who saved him had laid the ghosts of the war to rest. Upon returning, they had joined this organization together, driven by a shared desire to prevent other young men from falling into the darkness that had almost claimed them both. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas and Leo sat on their front porch. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft purple light of dusk. Leo rubbed the back of his hand absent-mindedly. The jagged white scar from the street fight on his 18th birthday stood out against his skin. He caught his father looking at it and offered a faint, rueful smile. He admitted that sometimes he wished it would fade away completely, so he would not have to remember the person he used to be. Thomas shook his head gently. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the silver-twisted mark on his forearm from the war. He placed his arm next to Leo's hand. Thomas told him that he used to think scars were ugly marks of failure. He used to hide them, but he had learned the truth. A scar means you survived. It means you were broken, but you healed. He looked Leo in the eyes. He said that being a father does not mean shielding your child from every scratch. The world is too sharp for that. Being a father means showing your child your own scars so they know that healing is possible. It is about teaching them how to stitch themselves back together. Leo looked at his hand, then at his father's arm. He nodded slowly, the shame of the memory replaced by understanding. That scar was his compass. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Thomas stood up. He patted Leo on the shoulder, reminding him that they had an early start at the center tomorrow. Leo stood up with him, and together they walked back into the warmth of the house. On the mantel, the grandmother's diary rested openly, a testament to the love that had guided them home. The shadows were gone, replaced by the enduring light of legacy. Thomas and Leo remind us that the deepest love is found not in hiding our past, but in the courage to share our scars and heal together. If this story moves you, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments, be it your city, your state, or your country. We truly cherish connecting with our community. Don't forget to subscribe for more touching tales to keep these stories alive. There's another heartwarming journey waiting for you on the screen right now, so please click to continue exploring the power of the human spirit with us.